Father Picket Wall coming to you from the corner of Littleton and Lawrence Street with church member Joe Jackson with the first chapter of our oral history project. Dr. Joe, in October of 1983, you found yourself in Grenada, a Caribbean island off the coast of Venezuela. You were not there on a tropical vacation. Tell us a little bit about how a kid from Columbia, South Carolina, made it to that point in history.
I was always interested in one of the military academies, and Strom Thurmond had a civil service exam for the post office, and I got the highest grade. One of my classmates never ceases giving me grief, and I beat him out. And I went down around Christmas to his office, and he said, "Well, I don't have anything in the Air Force Academy, and don't have anything, and I might have some to the Air Force, but I got one to West Point." My father-in-law, future father-in-law, was related to General Westmoreland, and I had met him, and I carried General Westmoreland's parents' paper that lived on Waccamaw in Columbia. So I accepted the appointment, and oddly enough, after I'd gone through all the matriculation to West Point, Navy asked me to send some film, and by return mail, I got an appointment to play football at Annapolis, and I always wondered how that would have worked out. But I ended up going to West Point. I played football for 2 years, played rugby. I was fortunate enough to go to England on an exchange trip, and I also hosted the Canadian Military Academy's exchange trip to West Point, and then took a contingent up to Royal Military Academy then. So West Point opened up a whole new world to me. I elected to go into infantry. And then in those days, we would have to go to our Ranger School and airborne school. You got a little extra money, like $110 a month, to jump out of airplanes. And I had a great Ranger buddy, Doc Winsel, who had been my roommate, and we had very good training in Ranger School, Infantry Basic, and Airborne. Then I served in the 82nd Airborne Division. The first time I ever got shot at, I think is interesting for the younger people, was 1968, and the riots commemorating our Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. And this has been extremely painful for me, who's someone who's been in the country service since I was 21 years old. And you wonder how much has changed. And I volunteered for all those schools that I mentioned. I volunteered for Vietnam and served with the 1st Air Cav. I had a very vigorous experience there. I was in the field for about 10 months. I started out as a rifle platoon leader, then a battalion reconnaissance platoon leader, and there were a lot of vacancies, so I got to be an infantry company commander. I received 3 Bronze Stars while I was in Vietnam. Came back and taught ROTC at Clemson, and was fortunate enough to apply for an Army scholarship program down at Medical University of South Carolina. And Army sponsored, graduated there, then trained in San Antonio in orthopedics. And I went to Germany, where very shortly I was the chief of orthopedics at Landstuhl, which is a big receiving center for all the casualties in the from the Middle East. But it was a good experience. We were all young, and I was shortly the chief there. And then my wife was pregnant. We're from Columbia. We wanted to get close, and so the only place I could get close was to get back to the 82nd, and I was about 38 years old, which is really too old to be jumping out of planes. And being an orthopedic surgeon, you really know how badly this can end for you. It's not the jumping, it's the landing that gets you. And I was interested in operational medicine, and I read an article, Military Medicine, about my namesake, who was a Major Jackson with the British and the Falklands, talking about ultralight forward surgical support teams, and we were implementing this in the 82nd, but the 82nd is the tip of the spear. And one night I got a call and said, well, we need you to come in, bring all your gear. And went in. My wife said, where are you going? I said, I can't tell you, but watch the news in the morning. And so we assembled and were en route to Grenada within a few hours at night. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was going to precede us, and they had scouted the anti-aircraft guns. And so the Rangers jumped in at 300 feet underneath the guns. But at that altitude, you can't use a reserve parachute because it won't work. And we were behind them, ready to do the same thing, but they took the runway. We landed down there in the middle of the night, and we had no way to talk to the Air Force, no way to talk to the Navy. We had Navy SEALs, we had Marines on one end of the island, and we had a ragtag group of paratroopers that fed in piecemeal. So we set up in a construction shack on the radio, on the runway at Port Salinas. Our reason for intervening, there were 2 campuses of medical students. And at Port Salinas, where we were, on the eastern end of the runway, there was a medical student contingent. And it was strategically important, and we didn't want a hostage situation with the medical students. And so we piecemeal fed in supplies, but as we were getting ready to depart that night, we had a medical clearing company, and there were a lot of women in it. And so they went back and said, well, Sally, you can't go to war. And so we had a lot of substitutes that went down there. We had no nurses. And we had some casualties that were light. For instance, I had some pictures of a fellow who was carrying a weapon sight in his fatigue pocket, and he was shot in that leg. It's like having on an armored vest, and so we were able to take care of that. We had another low velocity gunshot wound to the forearm, and we had the USS Guam. This was billed as a hospital ship. We found out they had 1 operating room and 4 beds, and we couldn't talk to the Navy. And so the Rangers took off right where we were. We were camped right with the Rangers, and for about a week, I had a parachute canopy. That was my shelter. And we scrounged medical supplies, and the Rangers had a buddy system of first aid. And so they would carry, each man would carry IV administration set in an IV bag. So we collected all those, and we scrounged a bunch of equipment from the Grenada hospital. It was very primitive, and got a bunch of Russian equipment like lights and improvised operating tables that we got. And so the Rangers took off, and they went out with 6 Black Hawk helicopters. When they came back, they only had 3. So we had 3 Black Hawk helicopters go down at one time in very primitive facilities in the middle of a rainstorm. And so we had some young, inexperienced corpsmen and doctors who were basically out of internship, but smart, very motivated. And so we collected the casualties, and about the time we were triaging these casualties, addressing the most serious ones, and the Navy accidentally shot up the headquarters of the 2nd Brigade with their jets rolled hot on the dock, and so here comes another flood of casualties. So we had been down there without any sleep for 2 or 3 days. Some of the things that stick in my mind about this is that afternoon, an Air Force guy came over and said, do you think you'll need any bigger aircraft? And I said, I think we're going to need 2, about 7 o'clock. And so, like clockwork, they came down and landed, and we had the chaplains out there in the middle of the rainstorm holding up IV bags and sheltering the wounded. We loaded our great majority of these, afterwards stabilized them onto these C-141 aircraft to go to Roosevelt Road, Puerto Rico. We had Carl Snyder, a good friend of mine, class of 65, took a helicopter load of the wounded out to the Guam in the rainstorm, and he didn't come back for 2 days. We were looking for him, and we found out that in an emergency, an Army helicopter can land on a Navy ship, but they won't let it take off. And we were scheduled a little later on that year to go to Spain and practice interacting with the Air Force and the Navy. This was the first forced landing on foreign soil since MacArthur landed at Incheon in 1951. So it takes a little practice to do that. So by God's grace, we were able to anticipate and get the casualties where they were stable. We did not lose anybody that night. We lost one Ranger, and I remember that we had him basically standing on his head with about 4 IVs and shock trousers on him, Sean Lucatino. And he's the only one that died from that batch of casualties. But again, thinking about God preparing you for doing things, I competed for the expert field medical badge when I got to Fort Bragg. You had to shoot, and you had to march and navigate. And I remember the medical service corps officer said, "Well, you better not fail this, Colonel." And I said, "Well, I don't plan to do that." But it taught you the capacity of the fixed wing aircraft, helicopters, and how to do that. That was fresh in my mind, and that was fortuitous. And at Fort Bragg, we had a bunch of very outstanding young orthopedic surgeon. Carl Savory was one of my classmates, and Carl is in the Ranger Hall of Fame. He was on Desert One when we tried to rescue the Iranian hostages, but we all took the advanced trauma life support course, and we all adopted a unit. Like Carl had Delta. Bill Roden, who was a captain of the Army football team in his day, was down with me in the Grenada, and Bill had adopted the Special Forces. So we all adopted some of these special units, and we're interested in not only being good, competent clinicians, but operational surgeons to do that. And I think every orthopedic surgeon we had at Fort Bragg, with the exception of Glenn Shaber, who was our boss, was a West Pointer. And the great majority of them, all except Bill, had been in combat. And Bobby Knight, the Army basketball coach, said you have to win in 2 things. You have to win in war, and you have to win in surgery. So that was our mindset. So we handle all these, and then when the dust had settled, we were all just exhausted, no sleep, no food. And coming through the line, and this is when I told Pickett about last year, this lady who had 3 or 4 children came through the lines, and she was in active labor, and there was no way to get to a hospital. So here are these combat surgeons, and we didn't have to do a whole lot of work except be a cheerleader. So we had this lady coming through, and the baby was born. I have some pictures of those. But I told her that said to me that this is amidst horrible trauma, death, and destruction, the circle of life goes on. And that was very inspirational. I'll never forget that. And I thank God prepared me to do my job. Then about a day after this, there was a boatload of nurses coming over from one of the resorts, St. Bart's or Kitts, one of these, and General Trudeau was out there, and he was shooing away these nurses. And I go over to put my arm around him. I said, "General, I'll handle this. We need these nurses." So we got them on board, and then we started doing a civic action type thing. We would armor up a bus, and we would drive down to downtown, and there were a lot of civilian casualties. There was a hostile overthrow of Maurice Bishop was the presiding political figure of the time, and they were trying to overthrow him with all the Cubans and North Koreans and Libyans. And so a lot of people were fleeing that action to jump from a height. So we would go down and help the civilians. It turned out to be a very satisfying experience in the civic action. So this was the impetus, I think, that I wrote a little bit about this. I gave some talks. I went right up to Walter Reed for my hand fellowship after this. And but the pioneer of what happened when we went on Desert Storm and Desert Shield, we had these light forward surgical teams to get up front where the the wounded were taken care of, and it was phenomenal. That it's horrible that anybody dies in combat, but it's something like if you could make it to one of these four surgical teams, you would have only a 1% chance of dying, and so but you learn a lot in wartime that you can apply in peace.
And you've been back to Vietnam, haven't you? And worked.
Yes, I volunteered the first time, and I went back in '95 with some people from the medical school, MUSC, and volunteered there. Went down to Ho Chi Minh City, which was Saigon, and then up the way. And then I went back again in 2008, and I had a roving hand symposium again. Saigon, went to Hue, and then we took a bus van that we rented with volunteer Mike Lamb, who's actually visited Phan Savon and me here, and we drove through Ho Chi Minh's birthplace and a place where I had to dust up at the Mekong Bridge, and then stayed in Hanoi and visited it, and actually operated and gave lectures at a military hospital. And it was very interesting. They could tell that I'd been there before. And then that other, in '08, I went to Iraq. A friend, Kathy McHale, we went for Teach for America. We went to Erbil, Iraq to teach there. Also went to Fiji one time. That wasn't too much of a hardship tour.
That's real nice. I am jealous of your Iraq trip more than any.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to see some of the historic sites there.
Erbil is a great book for the younger people that you might enjoy reading about the Middle East, called The Source. And Michener wrote about a tell, and a tell is where one ancient city and civilization is overrun, and they build right on the rubble. So Erbil is the oldest continuously occupied city in the world. It's over 6,000 years old. And the Museum of Kurdish History is on about 600-foot high tell for all those conquered cities, and they built on top of the rubble. That culture is extremely interested, but everyone has a sad story, unfortunately.
They do. Anna Joyce one, like the birth of that baby out there
Yeah.
In Grenada, which is a special story that you shared with us last year during one of our Wednesday night services. And we all here at Grace Church and in the community are grateful for your service and for all of the talent and skill that you garnered from that service and have been able to share with the world.
Well, I feel blessed. I'd like to do it again.